I want to remind you of a statement I may have shared with some of you before. It was something that a former pastoral team member at this church, when Anita and I were members here years ago, said in a sermon one day. His name was Clarence Schilt. Clarence simply said, "We do most of our sinning when we're right." And I would add to that, or when we believe we're right. It's very easy to move into spaces that are not good when I think I am protecting and defending a righteous cause. Charles Colson was right-hand man to President Richard Nixon when Nixon was in the White House when the Watergate affair erupted. Colson, who later became a devoted follower of Jesus, said, "When I went into public service, I went into public service with all kinds of high and lofty aspirations. I wanted to make a difference in the world, a difference in the country. I wanted to contribute my whatever gifts they were to what the country needed. That was very important to me." But he said, as I was in office over a period of weeks and then months, a year or two, I came to believe that the best for the country meant that this particular president, President Nixon, had to remain in office. And as I became convicted that everything depended on that, I was willing to do anything to make that happen. So he tells the story of a political rival who wasn't a terrible threat yet, coming on the horizon and them deciding we've got to do something about this. So Colson said, we planted a story in the press that had zero foundation in truth, zero. And it destroyed him. Destroyed his political career. But it was okay because we were defending what was right. And Clarence said, we do most of our sinning when we're right. And I would add, when we think we are. That's where the disciples were, and that's what they ardently, passionately believed. We go to Luke chapter 9 for the story today. It's an important moment in the ministry of Jesus because at the beginning of this story, you will see a line that tells us that Jesus is turning his face to head resolutely for Jerusalem. He realizes that the time has come when his destiny at Calvary draws nearer. It is now time to journey to Jerusalem. Now, mind you, this is going to be a long journey. Will take at least 9 chapters to get there. Luke's teaching, what he includes in this section of his gospel, much of it is unique to Luke. We don't see it in Matthew, Mark, or John. But what's especially important to understand is that the focus of Jesus in this section is especially on his disciples. He is especially focused on trying to teach them, this is what it means to be my disciple. You have to keep that in mind as we read this story, because this is the headliner. When he turns his face to Jerusalem, when it comes to the first lesson he wants to teach them about discipleship, this is the story. Luke 9, verse 51. As the time approached for him, that is Jesus, as the time approached for him to be taken up to heaven, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem. And he sent messengers on ahead who went into a Samaritan village to get things ready for him. But the people there did not welcome him because he was heading for Jerusalem. When the disciples James and John saw this, they asked, "Lord, do you want us to call fire down from heaven to destroy them?" But Jesus turned and rebuked them. Then he and his disciples went to another village. In order to truly understand the story, you have to have a bit of background and context. The first piece of context is this: hospitality was of supreme importance. After all, this was a land that was often forbidding and severe. This was a land where food could be very hard to come by and water even harder to come by. That liquid of life on which they depended could easily run out, and then you were at the mercy of the elements. And so hospitality was extremely important. It was understood that you could ask anyone, or anyone would offer it to you, friend or even foe. Profoundly important. So when Jesus sends the messengers ahead of him, go to the Samaritan village, get things ready there, we're all coming, we're going to stay there, it is an entirely reasonable expectation. Except that the Samaritan said, where are you going? Jerusalem? No room in the inn. No vacancy. And that brings us to the second piece of background we have to understand as we read this passage, and that is the deep and divided hostility that existed between ancient Jew and ancient Samaritan. It was profound. It was a blood feud. When you read the story, read the history of this division, this anger, this polarization, it was hundreds of years old. It was centered on two things, on race and on religion. The hatred was deep. Blood had been shed. There were often skirmishes, even in the time of Jesus, that would break out. And so when the messengers come back and they say, no way can we stay in this village because we're headed to Jerusalem. James and John, Jesus had called them the sons of thunder. James and John want to go Old Testament on them. They say, what? They won't let us stay? We'll go Elijah on them. And they dip back to two stories in Elijah's life, two times in Elijah's life, where the honor of God is at stake, where an understanding of the true God is at stake. And Elijah, in his blood and guts prophet style, wreaks vengeance on his opponents. So James and John say, is that what they say? Then Jesus, let us call down fire and destroy them. After all, that's what you do with enemies, right? You destroy them. But the text says, Jesus rebuked them and said, we're going somewhere else. Now, I'd like to lay another story alongside this one. Another story, I'm not going to read from it, because it's very familiar, and I only want to refer to one part of it. To this story in Luke chapter 9, I want to add the story in John chapter 4. The story of Jesus sitting at a well and talking to a Samaritan woman. She is overcome with surprise that he, a Jewish man, would engage her. The conversation at first feels like it's kind of just meandering. Jesus is asking questions. She's providing answers, asking her own questions. And then comes a moment in time. A moment when she realizes this is more than just a man in front of me. This is somebody with a connection to God. And so she says to him, sir, I perceive you're a prophet. Tell me, settle something for me, answer a question for me. We say it's the temple in Samaria. You say it's the temple in Jerusalem. Which one is it, sir? Where can I find God? She, just as do the disciples in Luke 9, she lives in an either-or world. It's either here or it's there. It's the same world that the disciples, in all of their rage and anger, the same world that the Samaritans that turned them away, the same world they inhabited. It's an either-or world. And yet Jesus, in his response to this Samaritan woman, if you'll permit me to paraphrase his words, he says, it's neither. Because God is doing a new thing. Something totally new. That's what you ought to be concerned about. So then our question becomes, well, exactly what is it that God is doing? What is this new thing in which God is engaged? For an answer to that, I want to go to a different place. This time I want to go to the corpus of Paul's letters. To Paul's letter to the Ephesians, to which I have a bias. I love Ephesians. Because in Paul's letter to the Ephesians, he tells us exactly what the new thing is. This new thing explains why when the disciples want to destroy their enemies, Jesus just says, no, we're not doing that. He rebukes them. We'll go somewhere else. When Jesus sits down at the well, this new thing is why he engages a woman in conversation. The new thing that God is doing is that to which Paul commits his entire life. So what is that new thing? Ephesians 2, verse 14. For he himself is our peace. Jesus, that is. He himself is our peace, who has made the two groups one and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility, by setting aside in his flesh the law with its commands and regulations. Pay attention. His purpose was to create in himself one new humanity out of the two, thus making peace, and in one body to reconcile both of them to God through the cross, by which he put to death their hostility. Right there, Paul identifies what the new thing is that God is doing. I want you to especially notice it in verse 15. He says very simply and very clearly, his purpose was to create in himself one new humanity out of the two, thus making peace. One new humanity. There are at least two Greek words that Paul could have chosen to use when he writes one new humanity. One is the Greek word naos. Naos means new in time. New in time. Is that a new dress? It's a pretty dress. Did you get a new car? How do you afford that? You got a new car? I think that's a new iPhone, isn't it? It is, huh? New. New in time. At a point in time, this one is new. There may have been tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, multiplied millions of these before. But right now, at this moment in time, this one is new. Naos. That is not the word Paul chose. The second word is kainos. Kainos is not new in time. It's new in kind, in quality. This is brand new. There has never been anything like it before. It's not only new at this moment in time, it's new in kind. Kainos, that's the word Paul chooses. He says God's work in the world was to create one new, one kainos humanity out of the two, thus making peace, and to reconcile both of them to God through the cross, by which he put to death their hostility. So the mission and message of Jesus when he comes is to say, I am here to create a new humanity. Dr. Shirley Mullen is a woman she's the emeritus president of Houghton College, well-known historian, author, wrote a book 2 or 3 years ago called Claiming the Courageous Middle. Just this past week in a personal conversation with Dr. Mullen, we talked about this passage. She said to me, understand that what God is doing is he's not averaging the two extremes. Let's take an average of these two extremes and then we'll make that the middle. That's not what he's doing. He's doing a new thing, a place of conviction, a place of commitment, a place where people stand for something that is ultimately important. In other words, if I were to summarize Dr. Mullen's words, she's saying, Jesus isn't saying, okay, we're going to take some of the best stones and bricks and rocks, pieces of the Samaritan temple, put those here, and take some of the best stones and blocks and pieces of the Jewish temple here. We'll build that. And then we'll take some of your best concepts of God. We won't take them all, but the best ones. Some of your best concepts of God. We'll join those together. We'll make that be our religion. And we'll bring the best member. You know, some of those, they can stay there. But the best members we'll bring. Same thing over here. Those don't come. Now we have the middle. That's not what he's doing. He's saying, I will take anyone. Anyone. And I'm not seeking an average. I am creating a new humanity. A new people who understand Jesus and his love and his mission to a degree that it is their ultimate commitment. It supersedes all other commitments. I want to read you just one rather short paragraph from a New Testament scholar, Alan Culpepper, who writes about these things and the direction that Jesus is moving people. This incident, the disciples and the Samaritans in the fire, he writes this way. This episode allows us to study the temptation to use violence to achieve right. Does insult entitle one to do injury? Does being right or having a holy cause justify the use of force or violence? Elijah had called fire down on the Samaritans. Could not Jesus' followers do the same? Misunderstanding the identity of the one they followed, the disciples mistakenly thought they could achieve his ends by violence. How often have those who claim to be following Christ repeated the mistake of those early disciples? They had yet to learn that violence begets violence and that Jesus had come to break the cycle of violence by dying and forgiving rather than by killing and exacting violence, revenge. Now, we're talking about the followers of Jesus, about the new humanity that Jesus is creating. We're talking about us. So we say we can't fix Washington. We can't fix what's going on out in the greater political arena. We ought to be good citizens, vote, and get involved in whatever ways we are gifted to and called to be involved. But we can't fix that. What we can do is do something about this, about us, about our community, about what it means to be followers of Christ, what it means to be the new humanity. That we can do something about. And I just have an inkling that if we take Jesus seriously and do something about that here, if we stop cursing the darkness and start lighting candles, it just may affect that in surprising ways. I had an insight this week that explained some things to me. So we were pastors, all of us were over in Riverside for a Southeastern California Conference pastors meeting. Heather Thompson Day made 2 presentations to us that were exceptional, just outstanding. She said something that got me to going online and searching this out. It's a Stanford report on a study that was done that said historically the deepest commitments of the people who are American citizens have been to 3 things: to their race, to their language, to their religion. Those have been their deepest commitments. But starting a few years ago, that has shifted. Now there is something that has replaced all 3 of those commitments as the preeminent commitment of importance. It is our commitment to our political party. Just let that settle in. The study showed that people are now more committed to their political party than to their race, to their language, or to their religion. That's the preeminent commitment. Friends, if you follow this Jesus of Nazareth, he says, not in my kingdom. In my kingdom, your first commitment is not to a religion or a denomination or even a local church. Your preeminent commitment is to God. following the footsteps of Jesus. That's very difficult to do in an either-or world. The disciples lived in an either-or world. It's either us or them. The Samaritan woman lived in an either-or world. It's either that temple or that one. We live in an either-or world. Nobody wants to have you say two different things. Nobody. For example, in our either-or world, is it possible to say what happened to Israelis on October 7 was horrific? And what has happened in Gaza since is unspeakable. Both are true. Can that be said? No. People want to back you into an either-or corner. You can't say both of those things. You have to stand for this side or this side. Can't do that. There are so many realities that come into play in that either-or world. I have watched many times. I've watched congressional hearings, either in the House or in the Senate, where a new political appointee or someone, because of something that has happened, comes forward. And they're being questioned now by both sides. Both sides of the aisle are asking them questions. I thought about even using some of the Congress people's or the senators' names, but I thought, it probably will detract from the point because of the visceral feelings we have. But I have watched it. I have watched somebody on the Republican side say, I'm going to ask you a question, and I want a yes or no answer. That's it. Yes or no. I've watched somebody from the Democrat side say, I'm going to ask you a question, I want a yes or no answer. And yet the question they ask requires nuance. It requires conversation. It requires listening and engaging. And yet, such is seldom allowed. Out comes the Republican bulldozer, the Democrat bulldozer, and they plow right over the person. So some say, well, they're just trying to filibuster, not answer the question. I'm sure that's the case at times, but that is not all of the case. We've lost our civility, our ability to say, in an either-or world, maybe there is a way to say neither side has the full truth, plainly and simply. And maybe for a follower of Jesus, there is a different way forward. In fact, I was struck 3 years ago maybe by a book advertisement that came across my desk that asked the question. First line of the advertisement was, are you too conservative for progressives and too progressive for conservatives? I said, that's a book I got to read. Got the book, I read it. It was written by members of the AND campaign, A-N-D, AND campaign. In an either-or world, they said, maybe we need to focus on AND. It's a campaign that was started by largely African-American pastors, but especially attorneys and some other leaders in the public square, to say, if we don't stop what we're doing, we're going to destroy ourselves. There has to be a way in the public arena for us to talk. And so they said, we as followers of Christ have to stand for sanity and for civility. They have a term, co-belligerence. I asked that it be put on the screen because when Isaac saw it this morning, he said, I'm not even sure what that means. I said, well, you can come up and explain it. Co-belligerence. So the word belligerent means I'm struggling against something. I'm kind of fighting against something. That's the word belligerent. Do you know that Seventh-day Adventist pioneers were belligerents in their day and world? Joseph Bates, one of our key three founders, had a very difficult time being able to preach in the South because of his outspoken opposition to slavery. John Byington, our first General Conference president, participated in the Underground Railroad. They were belligerents, pushing back against something. So what the AND campaign says, we are co-belligerents. And what they mean by that is we will stand with you. We will say at times to one side or the other, we will stand with you on this issue. But understand, we are not endorsing your whole platform. We'll stand with you on this issue because we believe it is morally right or morally wrong. However, don't get too excited because we may come right over here and stand with them on this other issue. We are co-belligerents with you on this issue, but don't think you own us because we have one who owns our hearts, and that's Jesus. Been deeply moved. In fact, last year, Wednesday before the election, through the work of Jesse contacting him, Justin Gibney, and came and spoke here at chapel, encouraging us to claim that middle space with conviction and with love and with a commitment to speak in civil ways and to work out issues in the public square. I want to read you just two brief, I think they're both one-sentence quotes, in fact, from Gibney and his colleagues in their book. The goal is not to have all Christians share the exact same politics, but to have all Christians think Christianly about politics. Second sentence, the U.S. political system is dangerously polarized, and both sides frame the issues to fit incomplete or dishonest narratives. When the issue isn't framed properly, there isn't a correct answer. So we look at the spiritual arena and we say, Jesus is doing a new thing. He's rejecting the either or. Might it be possible that if that is who we are, we might be able to stand in civil ways in the society? The one I mentioned a moment ago, Shirley Mullen, writes this: the affirmation of the importance of all unites a community in the face of deep difference that motivates a religious community to continue listening to each other, to make room for hospitality, and to be open to the possibility that is what is needed is a larger vision of God rather than a better argument for one or another of the polarizing positions on a particular issue. A larger vision of God and his creation of a new humanity, rejecting the either or polarities, saying there is another way. It requires listening, respect, civility. Yes, have your convictions, but be ready to stand for them with truth and grace. So what might that accomplish? I want to read you a story. Miguel Veraza, my colleague, shared this with me this week. It's from the pen of Max Lucado. He writes, Elie Wiesel was a correspondent for a Jewish newspaper in Paris, France in 1954. A decade earlier, he was a prisoner in a Jewish concentration camp. A decade later, he would be known as the author of Night, an account of the Holocaust. Eventually, he'll be awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and the Nobel Peace Prize. But tonight, Elie Wiesel is a 26-year-old unknown newspaper correspondent. He's about to interview the French author François Mauriac, who is a devout Christian. Mauriac is France's most recent Nobel laureate for literature and an expert on French political life. Wiesel shows up at Mauriac's apartment, nervous and chain-smoking, his emotions still frayed from the German horror, his comfort as a writer still raw. The older Mauriac tries to put him at ease. He invites Wiesel in, and the two sit together in a small room. Before Wiesel can ask a question, however, Mauriac, a staunch Roman Catholic, begins to speak about his favorite subject, Jesus. Wiesel grows uneasy. The name of Jesus is a pressed thumb on his infected wounds. Wiesel tries to reroute the conversation, but can't. It is as though everything in creation leads back to Jesus. Jerusalem? Jerusalem's where Jesus ministered. The Old Testament? Because of Jesus, the old is now enriched by the new. Marioc turns every topic into the Messiah. The anger in Wiesel begins to heat up. The Christian anti-Semitism he'd grown up with, the layers of grief from Siget, Auschwitz, and Buchenwald, it all boils over. He puts away his pen, shuts his notebook, and stands up angrily. "Sir," he said to the still-seated Marioc, "you speak of Christ. Christians love to speak of him, the passion of Christ, the agony of Christ, the death of Christ. In your religion, that's all you speak of. Well, I want you to know that 10 years ago, not very far from here, I knew Jewish children, every one of whom suffered 1,000 times more, 6 million times more than Christ on the cross. And we don't speak about them. Can you understand that, sir? We don't speak about them." Marioc is stunned. Wiesel turns and marches out the door. Marioc sits in shock, his woolen blanket still around him. The young reporter is pressing the elevator button when Marioc appears in the hallway. He gently reaches for Wiesel's arm. "Come back," he implores. Wiesel agrees, and the two sit on the sofa. At this point, Marioc begins to weep. He looks at Wiesel but says nothing, just tears. Wiesel starts to apologize, but Marioc will have nothing of it. Instead, he urges his young friend to talk. He wants to hear about it, the camps, the trains, the deaths. He asks Wiesel, "Why haven't you put this to paper?" Wiesel tells him the pain is too severe. He's made a vow of silence. The older man tells him, "Then you must break it, you must speak out." That evening changed them both. The drama became the soil of a lifelong friendship. They corresponded until Marioc's death in 1970. Marioc even dedicated a book on Jesus to Elie Wiesel, who was a crucified Jewish child. What if Marioc had kept the door shut? Would anyone have blamed him? Cut by the sharp words of Wiesel, he could have become impatient with the angry young man, and have been glad to be rid of him. But he didn't, and he wasn't. He reacted decisively, quickly, lovingly. He was slow to boil, and because of that, a heart began to heal. Friends, we live in an either-or world. So many forces are at work to keep you from saying, "This is true, and so is this." And we need to find a better way forward. And that requires conversation, listening, and goodwill toward the other. A friend of ours who's helped lead many trips. Mom lives just outside Jerusalem. We've been in her home at different times. She's taken that old Jewish prayer, "Pray for the peace of Jerusalem." Do you know what she prays now? What she tells her friends to pray now? She says, "Pray for the peace of Jerusalem and her neighbors and the whole world." That's the vision we need. The vision to sit at a well, ask questions, and listen. And the ability to graciously say, "God is doing a new thing, a new thing." And we want to be part of that. So this week, listen to someone. Talk humbly to someone. And become a part of the new thing God continues to do.